We need less content. No one said ever. In today's world of always on campaigns, creative operations leaders need to become the architects of global content supply chains. So, are you ready to harness the power of offshore production to scale creative output at the speed of marketing? On this episode, we're joined by Anil Noorani, founder and managing partner at TKM Consultants. With over 2 decades of experience, Anil advises global brands on optimizing their creative production strategies. We'll dive deep into the world of offshore creative production, exploring how it's evolving from a cost-saving measure to a strategic imperative. Anil shares insights on building a flexible, scalable content production ecosystem. We'll talk about how to balance in-house agency and offshore resources, how to overcome cultural and communication challenges in global partnerships, and how to leverage technology and AI to enhance offshore collaboration. So whether you're considering your first offshore partnership or looking to optimize existing relationships, this episode will provide strategies and key insights for creative operations leaders. So sit back and listen as we scale our knowledge about designing, managing, and optimizing offshore production partnerships to stay ahead in the content. All right, Anil Noorani, welcome to the Creative Ops Podcast. So glad that you could join us today to talk about all things offshore production.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nish, for having me. I'm very excited about sharing some of my insights today, and I hope we have a wonderful conversation.
I am sure we will, because the reason I wanted to have this conversation with you is that offshore production has been increasing significantly over the last few years. So I think it's a good time to maybe shine a spotlight on it. And again, with your background in it, I think we're going to get a lot of insights into it that'll be helpful to the audience. But as we do on every episode, let's start off with the standard question. What's your definition of creative operations?
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm sure you've had a multitude of definitions over the years regarding creative operations, because it's become such a critical discipline, I think, for all organizations who are looking at generating brand awareness and customer acquisition. But fundamentally, the way I see creative operations is really the coming together of creative talent and resource, creative processes, and creative technology to produce assets, to produce omnichannel assets, and all variations of those assets for every channel, for every country, for every campaign. And I think creative ops, if it's done well, it can ensure fantastic quality of asset production. It can ensure pace and speed of asset creation, and it can ensure scale as well. And I think those are the 3 big watchwords that we're seeing at the moment around creative operational efficiency and effectiveness. So yeah, it's become a hugely important discipline. And I was listening to one of your earlier podcasts where you talk about the difference between marketing operations and creative operations. And I found that sort of difference fascinating as well. But creative operations, I think certainly in the UK and in the US for the clients that I work with, has become an area of huge importance and will continue to grow as we can see the sheer scale of asset production increasing.
So, as I usually do, guests always say things that take me off on these interesting tangents. And I want to do one right now if we could. So you just mentioned like UK versus US. And one of the questions I've got circling around in my head that I love your perspective on, because you work with clients on both sides of the pond, as they say.
Yeah.
Is there a difference in approach to creative operations that you found between the United States and the UK and perhaps more broadly Europe?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And I'm sure there'll be quite a lot of fantastic questions during the course of the next sort of 45 minutes. But I mean, broadly speaking, actually, I think they're fairly similar. I think the sheer scale and size of the US businesses means that the actual operations themselves are perhaps larger. I think there's a greater level of maturity, I would say, around perhaps technology utilization, workflow maturity. I think asset management, briefing and project management tools that have enabled the efficiencies around creative operations have perhaps been a little bit more utilized in North America than in the UK. But I think also creative operations as a discipline within in-house agencies is perhaps we're seeing a slight difference as well. I think in the US, the in-house agency creative operations model is more mature than it is in the UK. And I think that's just because that type of sort of operating framework, that structure, was born primarily out of North America and has sort of found its way into the UK over the last sort of 6 or 7 years. And we see that with some of the industry bodies that exist around creative operations as well. So, yeah, I think just it's more a question of scale and maybe an element of maturity and an element of technology utilization. But outside of that, I think they're fairly similar sort of structures within the two continents.
All right, that's a good insight. And that's a good jumping off point into our main focus today, which is offshore production. So offshore production is a term that I think most listeners will be familiar with and that they've heard about it. But I think there's lots of different definitions around what offshore production is, because I think we live in a world, there's all sorts of different models in which brands are working with external vendors. And I want to get to some of those other models, like there's offshore, nearshore, so on and so forth. But let's start off with offshore. How do you explain offshore production to a creative operations leader?
Yeah, so actually I keep it extremely simple, as I do with most things in my life. Offshore production is exactly the same as onshore production. It just happens to be in a low-cost economy. That fundamentally is the primary difference. I mean, I set up a studio in India in 2002, and it was the first offshore production solution of its type. And this was pre-Google, of course. And back then it was all about desktop publishing, but the maturity levels now around offshore production have been stratospheric over the last 5 years. And post-COVID, when organizations became familiar with working remotely anyway, they started to lean in on digital workflow in a way they never had before because everyone was remote. So they started to sort of change their mindset around what was possible. So in some organizations where production wasn't even done outside of the four walls of the studio, they suddenly found themselves having to use external parties or resources or freelancers that were sitting outside of their four walls. So then this idea of working outside of the creative studio that you're currently present in to working in an outsourced way, it's almost an extension of that. So offshore production is really the same as what you currently do, just in low-cost economies. And offshore production also lends itself, because of the nature of the low cost, it lends itself to greater scale. Because in many of these economies, you have very large talent pools coming straight out of university. There's a lot of subsidizing of talent now. There's lots of grants, especially as we've seen in India, which is the market leader, I would say, for offshore production. But in cities like Chennai, you've got some of the biggest agencies in the world, production agencies in the world, all resident in Chennai. We are Amnet, who I work very closely with. Hogarth Worldwide are there. TAG have been there for 20 years. Armand Donnelly are there. And suddenly you can't move for production talent. So in terms of resource, I think it's very similar. In terms of brand knowledge, and I think that's where there's a slight difference, there are certainly a lot of disciplines where you would probably want to retain those in country for cultural nuance primarily. So what we're seeing with the offshore market is where the work is more formulaic, mechanical, reversioning, for example, reformatting, that type of work, that type of post-production, tier 3, that's primarily being done offshore now or utilizing automation, which I'm sure we'll come on to. But we're definitely seeing a push into tier 2 production. And we're starting to see organizations actually build creative and production teams in India in a way that perhaps we hadn't seen a couple of years ago, because that market is becoming so big now. There's some brilliant people in India. So organizations like Netflix. I was in Boston last year at the in-house agency forum, and a couple of companies were actually building creative studios in Hyderabad and Bangalore. So they were actually building their own creative and production studios. So we're starting to see a sea change there also, where historically it's been offshore tier 3 production, but now we're seeing a move into tier 2. And again, Mumbai and the Bollywood, they're sort of pushing the boundaries of what's possible, because virtual production is becoming more prevalent, for example, in India. So yeah, offshore production, very similar to onshore, but it's all about scale. and utilizing the timelines as well. So obviously getting work done overnight. And it's a mature, very mature industry now, as you alluded to.
That's interesting to hear about the evolution of the offshore industry in India and how it's, if I could use the term, starting to move upscale from tier 3 to tier 2 and perhaps eventually knocking on the door of tier 1. To me, it sort of what you're explaining to me mirrors what I've seen in the software development world, where 40 years ago, the work that would get outsourced to India was, as you described it, very mechanical. But then over time, it started to move offshore. And then also for the market's own needs, like India is a big country. It now has a very vibrant and flourishing software development industry where they are building applications that eventually might be next generation global applications. So perhaps
Absolutely.
we'll see the same thing in the creative space as well.
Yeah, I think just to close off on that point as well, we talked about the in-house agencies maturing earlier in the conversation. And again, with the in-house agencies becoming pretty much standard now in most global brands around the world, as they decide that they want to become more strategic, as they want to move upstream into creative services and less into production, those production elements need to be done somewhere. And that's where we're seeing a real coming together of in-house and offshore, which again is a model that perhaps, again, 5 years ago didn't really exist in the way it does now. In-house teams are becoming more strategic in their nature, and they're starting to take on their more traditional external creative partners, so they can own more of that brand work and more of the ideation and more of the planning and more of the media, actually. So that's tier 2, tier 3 production moves offshore, and the in-house teams become more strategic. And it's a very fluid, very dynamic ecosystem at the moment. And I think organizations are trying to figure out what the right production models are for them. But it's undeniable, I think, now that the majority of organizations need to have some level of offshore production in play.
So let's say I'm a creative operations leader listening to this. I'm thinking about offshore production because I've seen other in-house agencies successfully use that model. But every organization is unique, especially in terms of their maturity and evolution. I think a lot of in-house agencies and this is my opinion based on what I've seen and been exposed to, really start off with, we're going to use our in-house agency to sort of be a all-in-one shop. So it's going to try and do the creative strategy, but I think most often they start off doing a lot of that production work, really. It's sort of seen as the benefits of proximity, having people in-house. So if we have something at the last minute, it can get done. And they still tend to rely on external agencies for that creative strategy work. I think what I'm hearing from you is, as those in-house agencies themselves move upstream and really focus more on the creative strategy, which I believe they should, because they're most closely embedded with the brand and the DNA of that brand, and outsource the offshore production work. What are the types of questions or even the decision tree a creative operations leader should go through to determine if and when they should be looking at offshore production? And then maybe even what types of decisions or questions they should be asking themselves to drive decisions around when to really scale it and get to the point of all tier 2 and tier 3 work goes offshore.
Yeah. So as you say, all organizations are very different, and they have different triggers naturally to determine when to engage with these models. And every year we produce the offshore, or the global benchmark report for content production, that leans heavily into offshore production. And in this year's report, 90% of organizations that were surveyed had offshore production capability. But in the previous 4 years of reports, it was actually 66% or 65%. So there's been quite a big push in the last 12 months, I would say, to organizations looking at offshore production. And that's one of the reasons is certainly the requirement around in-house agencies not being able to deliver assets quickly enough. The volume of assets is so significant now that that's a real challenge. In fact, there's a great quote on the front of the 2024 Global Benchmark Report from Nordstrom in North America, who basically said, Outsourcing with an offshore partner allows us the ability to produce content deliverables within a shorter SLA due to turnaround times. We've seen a campaign with 30 to 100 deliverables managed overnight with offshore compared to several days or weeks in-house. And it's not because the in-house team isn't capable, of course they are, they just have other priorities coming through now, like we've just discussed around strategic intent, as well as more planning. And I think if I was not a creative operations leader, I'd be also, one area that seems to come up often is actually the lack of planning or the inability to plan effectively, because it comes downstream from perhaps marketing teams that themselves are struggling with able to forecast what's coming down the pipe because there is so much content coming through. And therefore you need to be able to flex your resource models. And offshore production is a beautiful production model for being able to be flexible. So you're not like spending a huge amount of money on freelancers. You still have the guys that are brand immersed in your brand. They are brand guardians that sit at your offshore production studios, wherever that might be. It could be in India, it could be in Costa Rica, it could be in Mexico, Philippines. But those brand guardians are crucial because they will work on your brand consistently. However, they will have a team working alongside them that are flexible and can move with the peaks and troughs. So I'd say that would be a second area. A third area that I've seen creative operations leaders sort of really evaluate is what types of skills do we want to be investing in internally? So if basically post-COVID CGI, for example, was a great example. Photo studios shut down, companies moved into CGI. They just couldn't have that talent pool. Also, organizations were they were moving from retail to digital first strategy. They were selling more online. That shift was seismic and practically overnight. So when you needed those skills around digital marketing, around CGI, where do you look? Well, those talent pools did exist offshore to a greater extent than perhaps they did in the West, and at lower cost and more accessible. And so creative operations teams started to really recognize this. So they identified the right service lines where they needed new skills, but they didn't want to invest necessarily internally because it could just be for a single campaign or a handful of campaigns that were coming up. So they didn't need those skills regularly. And that's when they started to look at offshore production as well. And then I suppose the fourth point would be cost. Offshore production, cost is a hygiene factor now. It's not the reason to go offshore. The real reason to go offshore is access to resource, access to skills, access to capability, and access to flexible models. But because it happens to be in a low-cost economy, you benefit from the commercial value as well. And many of the leaders I've spoken with, in fact, there's a few quotes in that report I mentioned, they generally look at savings of around 30 to 40% based on their in-house structures, or their maybe even higher if they're looking at their external teams and their agencies in region. And you asked me the question about the UK and the US at the beginning. In the UK, you're probably looking at somewhere between 20 to 30% savings around offshore production, whereas in the US, you're looking at 30 to 40 and beyond. It can go up to 80% on video post-production. It can be down at 20% on PowerPoint decks, but at volume. CGI probably comes in at around 40%. And these numbers have become quite standardized now for most organizations. And I don't know whether they will change, but they've been pretty consistent for the last 2 to 3 years.
Is that difference in cost savings between the UK and the US because of what you mentioned before, the difference in scale? The more that you have to do, the more that even percentage-wise you're going to get greater savings out of using offshore production?
I mean, that's certainly one reason. If you do economies of scale, definitely deliver more value. There's no question about that. A lot of organizations build offshore production now into their value improvement programs and try to put around 40% as their benchmark. But in North America as well, just the sheer cost of hiring talent, of course, makes it more. If you can get the same talent or similar talent in India, you'll drive out significant costs that way. Physical space, a studio space, naturally. I mean, people still have studios and are investing more and more into certain types of studios for more immersive experiences. Some of that can be taken offshore as well and give you some savings. But fundamentally, it's a like-for-like comparison of the actual freelance cost or in-house cost or agency cost versus that of an offshore production partner.
Got it. So I find this interesting, like in terms of the value and the decision making around to offshore, not to offshore. Like flexibility is certainly one of them, and I want to dive more into that. The skill sets one is very interesting because as a creative operations leader, I think I would then be having discussions with my creative director around what types of skills do we want to have in-house and why are those skills important to have in-house? How is that related to, is that like, do you sort of, are you parts of those conversations where they're trying to determine what skills do we want in-house and what shapes that? Is that the types of campaigns they're going to want to run over the next 1, 2, 3 years? Or like, how does somebody go about determining what skills do we absolutely need to have in-house versus what are we comfortable tapping into an external resource for where we don't necessarily, quote unquote, own the skill set?
So what we're seeing, and again, I think this is fairly consistent, but when it comes to digital advertising, so digital banners, HTML5 coded digital banners, which also will obviously lead to automation at some point, and does currently for some organizations. So digital banners, digital out of home, email templates, PowerPoint decks, packaging artwork as well, I would say, those, and retouching. Those sorts of services are probably the ones that generally are offshore because they deliver the greatest level of value because of the mechanical and formulated way in which you sort of build those particular types of assets. But digital banners, if I was advising a client now, I would not be looking at hiring that type of skill in a studio in London or a studio in New York. It wouldn't make much sense, I don't believe. Packaging artwork is probably the most mature of all the services. That was the one that went out to India, for example, first in the early 2000s. Retouching has actually now started to become quite AI-centric, modifying backgrounds, for example. People are leaning in on the AI tools that are available. So those types of solutions, the ones that will probably be fully automated within 5 years, are the ones that you want to be taking offshore today and already move your business through that change mindset of having to reset and rebuild your studios. Because to keep offering those sorts of capabilities, you will price yourself out of the market, you won't be competitive, you won't get the talent because people aren't going to basically be looking to train themselves in those particular types of services because at some point automation will take over. But the intermediary road at the moment is a combination of offshore and automation for those services that I've just defined. So yeah, those 5 or 6 are probably the most common, I would say, of offshore.
Okay, so that's really good. That's really good insight. I'm a creative operations leader. I'm probably thinking about like, I want to offshore the content, as you said, that is highly mechanized. It's rote work. It's very step by step and paint within the lines. And I really like your comment about it's almost pre-AI then, or pre-full automation to go offshore. It's like that, it's that intermediary step where there's still lots of humans involved in the loop per se, but eventually, because it is highly mechanized, and highly mechanized to me is really just, it's a euphemism for saying, oh, we can train an algorithm on this eventually to do this. So that's maybe another thing for creative operations leaders to think about. Like, I think most agree that AI tools aren't there today where you can push a button and automate content creation. But in getting ready for it, offshore production might be an interesting way to sort of start training for that inevitable future of
exactly. A CEO of an agency, a very, very large global agency, once said to me, this is many years ago now, he said to me, automate first, offshore second, hire third. That was the philosophy for the business. And very large production agency, global, ultimately got acquired. And I really resonated with me back then as well. This is when automation was still very much in its infancy. But there are some things even now that you can't really automate in the way that you think you'd want to, but you find it can be challenging. I was interviewing someone who runs a creative studio for a very large gaming company. And she said to me, the customer acquisition calls in their digital banners are so complex that there is no technology out there that could deliver automated banners for them. And they create thousands and thousands of these things every hour. So we're not quite at that point, but automation is certainly, obviously, it's obvious that companies need to be looking at that and building their studios around what the world might look like in 2 to 3 years' time, as opposed to probably what it can do today, because offshoring is certainly a fantastic intermediary route. And offshore companies know that. They are also investing heavily in automation. And the advantage of using your offshore company partner for automation rather than buying your own would be that they work with a number of customers, and therefore the technologies that they have are often quite composable, integrated, and relevant for different types of channel and different types of service. And so they should theoretically have a broader base from which a client could tap into than if you just bring that technology directly in-house into your studio, which can be a bit limiting perhaps moving forward.
Okay. And I definitely want to get to like the effects of automation and AI, but we'll put a pin in that for a moment.
Okay.
Just sort of coming back to the decision tree. So I'm a creative operations leader. We have a scale issue in that we're being asked to do more and more. We have a speed or a time to market issue in that how quickly we have that windows are constantly getting compressed. And it could be because of the competitive landscape. It could be because the data is telling us something different today than it was telling us last week or last month when we're doing our planning. So as you said, we want that flexibility to be able to like scale up, scale down. We've also probably got it's also cost from two perspectives. One is just simply cost per asset. It's also, as you said, cost of hiring and having fixed costs, right? Of do I hire 50 or 100 people in-house to do this production work, or do I go external because that's going to be fixed salaries, benefits, all sorts of other costs related to that versus going offshore. And then flexibility. So I think all the ones that I just rhymed off are pretty easy for someone to wrap their head around. Flexibility, let's talk more about that, because flexibility is one of those words that it's very malleable. What is flexible to me might not be flexible to you. So is offshore production as flexible as like, oh, it's Monday at 9 a.m. I see in my inbox, we've got a whole bunch of new requests. I'm going to call Anil and say, hey, can we just fire up a bunch of resources by 3 p.m. this afternoon? Or is it, and I'm going to assume it's not like that, having seen offshoring in the software development world in a previous life. But so talk to us a little bit about what does flexibility actually mean? And what's the value to me as a creative operations leader?
Okay. So when we talk about flexibility, if I can start just looking at it from the eyes of the commercial model to start with. So there are generally two types of commercial models that organizations offer. And then when you combine them, there's actually a third. So the first model would be, I'm basically going to have a team at my offshore production partner, and they're going to be my team. They're going to be an extension of my team. Full cultural alignment. I will probably have visited them. They may have visited me. That's my team. They do 160 hours a month, each individual. I have a team of 4 of them. I know exactly what volume I'm getting every month. That's the team that's going to be available to me. So it's an extension of your studio. They are completely focused on the production that you're going to brief to them. Now, the second model is transactional. So I have a campaign. I need help this month. Have you got anyone available? Ideally, I want to work with the same team that I worked with 6 months ago, but I can understand if they're not available, are they available? Now, it's very rare that an offshore partner will not do their absolute level best to make sure the same team available previously is available to you now, because it's in their interest to do that. They'll ensure that they get all their KPIs hit. There's going to be fewer amendments. There will be a familiarity with the brand and a familiarity with the ways of working. So that's the transactional model. And then the third model is hybrid, of course, which is I have a team of 4 individuals, but suddenly Black Friday's coming around the corner and I've got a huge selection and I've got 1,000 assets I need to produce. And it could be in Europe, so they could all be multilingual. It could be extremely complex. I need extra bodies. And that's when you put a transactional model on top of the FTE model. And the reason I've started with that particular structure is when you talk about flexibility, my experience of offshore production is, number one, because they generally have more people available and they also carry a lot on the bench, 5 to 10% of talent can sit on the bench because the actual salaries are, of course, lower. You can have a little bit more fat built in to give you some flexibility and therefore give your customers and your clients flexibility. There is often a layer available to you at very, very short notice. And that layer is where you could potentially get them delivering something within 3 or 4 hours when they weren't aware of that before the weekend. That's the first thing. Secondly, they do run 24/7 shift patterns. And if you're working obviously with India or Vietnam or the Philippines, you're getting overnight work. So there is significant flexibility there. They can work late into the night. So when you come back in, the work is being done and completed. And also, a lot of offshore production studios obviously have hubs around the world, as most global studios do. So you could have one facility in Central America and another facility in India to give you that flexibility. But fundamentally, it does come down to accessible resource. And offshore teams generally have much more resource. Organizations like we are Amnet, who I mentioned, they've got 1,200 people in Chennai and Pune. That's an extremely big studio, bigger than the Western studios have out in India. So access to that resource absolutely is a key component of giving creative operations leaders flexibility. What I would say is the hiring, if you wanted to bring in your own FTE team, the hiring policies in certain countries mean that can take a little bit longer. So if you've decided that you want to work with a partner offshore, it's probably, I'd recommend that you give yourselves a couple of months if you wanted a dedicated team and you wanted to hire them and you wanted to be part of that hiring process. It's sort of like a 2 to 3 month program. But if you were literally using them for transactional, you could probably brief them in on Monday. And if they are immersed in the brand and there's a cultural fit already available, like culturally you're ready to offshore, you could be turning work around within a week. And actually, there's another quote on the 2023 report from a lady called Marie, who's head of creative operations at Norwegian Cruise Line. She's based in Florida. And she talked about, I needed 600 assets producing within a couple of weeks. My offshore team stepped up. That was her first engagement with her offshore team. So within 2 weeks, 600 assets were produced and out of the door. So it can be that fluid and that instant. But your company, as the creative operations leader, your company has to be culturally ready to embrace that model. And I think that can sometimes be a little bit of a stumbling block.
So I want to come back to what culturally ready means and Marie, but just to recap for the listener, to me, it almost seems like that hybrid model is probably the smartest model because I maybe have my core team. It could be 4 people or 40 people, depending on the scale of what I'm outsourcing. And that my core team really sort of links back to what you've mentioned a few times, which seems like a critical linchpin is they are going to really be an extension of my team. And over time, they're going to have a deep appreciation of our brand DNA and really understand how that needs to sort of be translated into that tier 3, tier 2 work. And there's a lot of deep understanding and going both ways between the brand and that core team. And then that overlay model to deal with things like Black Friday or just an opportunity that comes up and we need to scale production work to fuel a whole bunch of new campaigns that we hadn't planned for. That almost sort of feels like the Uber model of all of a sudden it's New Year's Eve and it's just like there's a huge spike in demand, but the network is able to just sort of rally around that demand and service it.
Yes. I mean, when you're talking about, I think you're starting to talk about onboarding actually and how one onboards and whether you do like an onboarding light where it's quite quick, it's done within a week, or whether you're doing an onboarding period which might be 3 months because there's a real cultural shift that needs to happen internally. And therefore, you have to go through a number of pilot programs, onboard on the technology, get familiar with ways of working. What's non-negotiable, of course, is quality, right? That has to be number one. Otherwise, there's no relationship to develop. But the one thing that should never be fast-tracked is the brand immersion. During that onboarding process, as you've identified, whether you're using a transactional model or a FTE model, you need a period of brand immersion. Those brand guidelines need to be well documented, need to be shared, questions need to be asked and answered. And that's where you can also, when you're analyzing your offshore partner, the communication is crucial. The cadence of the communication is crucial, as well as the actual language itself, both written and verbal. And that's when you can move quickly when you work with an organization that has fantastic communication skills, very well set out processes. Quite often you want to be checking if they're ISO compliant, for example, if they've got strong methodologies, project management methodologies internally, like a Six Sigma, for example. You want to be checking what technology they use internally. If they're technology enabled themselves and they're using a strong project management system with very good briefing, online approvals, I know that's an area you're an expert in as well. Online approvals is critical, strong reporting, good SLAs. You can establish all of this in the first couple of hours of meeting an organization. And then you'll get a sense of what it feels like to work with them. And if they check all of those boxes, the likelihood is you can probably move quite quickly with them. But the one thing I'd absolutely say, if I was working with an organization that was moving to an offshore team, look at the case studies, speak to the creative operations leaders in those organizations that company is already working with, and ask them what it felt like in those first 2 or 3 weeks, because that will give you huge amounts of insight as to, okay, this is what I need to prepare myself for. Because it will just feel a little bit different if you haven't used offshore before. If you have, then you can probably move very, very quickly. But if you haven't, then I would absolutely suggest starting small. And I would suggest doing pilots and going through that onboarding process, having those sunset reviews, getting those feedback loops in place for continuous improvement, and moving through the cycle, and then ramping up after a 6-month period, because then you can go hard.
So that, I think that's a good segue into coming back to culturally ready. And I think you touched on a lot of it. And let's take the word cultural out of it. It's just like, what does it take to be ready to do offshore production? And is that going to be a 2-week, or as you said, is that going to be a multi-month onboarding process? And I think it ties back to, and these are probably, I would imagine, questions that the offshore production partner is asking to the prospective brand, is how well documented are your processes? What kinds of systems do you use internally? And do you actually use the systems? Or is it sort of like, yeah, we have a system, but yeah, we sort of use it, but we also go out, we do a lot of quote unquote planning and coordination on Slack or on Zoom or around the coffee machine. And it's not all documented in the project management system. I think those things are critical. And I think offshoring in many ways probably forces the creative operations leader to close a lot of those process and technology and just ways of working gaps, if I can call it that. It's to make offshoring work and get the benefits of speed and cost. You've really got to have your game like running pretty tightly, because ideally your offshore partners and plugging into you and going, oh, we're plugging into this machine. We understand how this machine works because it's all sort of laid out in process documentation, is then reflected in how their technology is configured. But I would imagine there's some, perhaps most cases, where work has to be done on the brand side to actually be ready to get to successfully work with an offshore production partner. Otherwise, a lot of those benefits of speed and cost and scale are never realized.
It's a great point, a fascinating point you make, because yeah, you're right. So first of all, culture to me starts with the behavior of the team that are considering moving work offshore. Psychologically, are they ready to do that? Physically, are they ready to do that in terms of their own resource being available? Because there is a period of onboarding and you don't want to set yourselves up for failure. You have to basically allocate appropriate time. Technically, are they ready? As you said, as a CMO once said to me, marketing teams and creative operations teams are a graveyard of failed technology implementations. But actually, I think over the last 5 years, we've certainly, well, since post-COVID, we've really seen a much more effective utilization of workflow solutions, whether it's Workfront or Primo or Monday.com, whatever companies are using. So I think culture, behavior, physical, technology, and then a willingness to recognize we're going to be creating new value in our business by extracting more value from our offshore team. And I think once you're there psychologically, that actually this is going to be fantastic for our business over the next 3 to 5 years. It's going to free up budget to invest in the areas that we want to be working in, to be more creative, to allow us to immerse ourselves into meta and immersive experiences and actually train ourselves up into those areas. That psychologically, that's what I mean by, I think, cultural readiness. And then also there's the cultural alignment between the organization that you select to work with offshore and the organization that you work in. Now, one of the models that has certainly developed over the last three or 4 years, most global production agencies, you'll know who I'm talking about here, they all have offshore teams, but they also have Western studios. And therefore, the cost savings perhaps aren't quite there. The scale is still, the ability, the service offering and the capability is, but the cost savings may not quite be there. Whereas when you're working with a pure offshore company that doesn't have any production capability in North America or in the UK or in Europe, you need something else to deliver that cultural alignment. And that's where this concept of smart shoring is developed, where you have client service teams in country, in region, in fact, to make sure that there's a cultural alignment, both brand alignment and also physical ways of working. And those client services teams are your last mile to quality, to communication, to production readiness. So whilst you're getting all the benefit of scale and speed and cost savings from the offshore team, you also have regional client services teams who are an extension of your team, and they are the ones that are working with you day to day to ensure there's cultural alignment in the way in which you briefed and then the way in which the work gets produced and comes back to you for approval. And that smart shoring model is something that's developed over the last 4 or 5 years. And it's something that's very, very exciting because culture, the biggest challenges with offshore 10 years ago would have been culture, communication, and quality. And you've got to address those 3 things head on. And if you can address them head on, then you'll have a fantastic working relationship with an offshore partner.
All right. So if I'm a creative ops leader, I have to think about, are we process ready enough to work with an offshore partner? Are we technology ready enough to work with a technology partner? And those two are really mirrors of each other. And then most importantly, it seems like, or equally importantly, I'll say, is are we culturally ready to hand work off and have an effective, be good communicators back and forth so that that offshore team can over time really understand our brand and what we consider good quality work, and to provide effective feedback throughout that process, especially during that critical onboarding phase. And as you're saying, with this smart shoring model, there are now these client services teams. Do those tend to be account managers, or are they actually creatives themselves who sort of have an account manager mindset?
Like account managers, I would say.
Yeah.
They're a little bit more commercial than I would say like a creative perhaps needs to be. And therefore they are, but they're there as your customer success, your client liaison almost. And yeah, they become quite crucial, I think, to effective offshore. And I just going back to technology for a moment, I suppose it's not absolutely critical that let's just say an in-house studio who's thinking about an offshore model, it's not absolutely critical that they are fully technology enabled, because, I mean, it's great if they are, because then your offshore partner can plug straight in, and they often will. But as long as your offshore partner has a technology capability as well that you can plug into, if it's not quite working, whatever you have isn't working for you, then rely on them and lean in on them. But having technology is important because it brings out the metrics. And without metrics, there's no way of measuring success. And without the success measurement, we don't know how well we're performing. So those technology elements are important. And real rigor, I would say, around KPIs and SLAs. I would always look at a partner that offers that in spades and is familiar with delivering that information back to you on a quarterly basis, so you know how well they are performing.
So you mentioned KPIs and measurement. What are some of the KPIs that tend to be fairly common? Because offshore production doing that tier 3 and now starting to move into tier 2 work, it still to me seems far removed from like the marketing funnel. It's you're being asked to do certain things, but often without the insight and understanding of what are the campaigns and like where are these assets getting plugged into. So are your KPIs from an offshore production point of view, and as a creative ops leader, am I holding my offshore production team to, is it turnaround time? Is it cost per asset? What are the KPIs that matter?
Yeah, it's something that I think companies do wrestle with. Just in terms of your first point, I wanted to bring some clarity to that as well. I mean, I think one thing that I would love to see actually is the offshore teams being brought in earlier in the campaign planning process. I'm sure the production teams want to be closer to the creative process. I mean, this is something I know there's a number of consultancies in the UK and in the US that are often talking about, let's try and bring creative and production closer together because then we get the best of both worlds and we're ensuring that production teams are ready to deliver on those campaigns. But I think what's happened over the last 5 years is that the offshore teams are almost a little bit of an add-on. So they need to be brought in early on in the year when those campaigns are being planned, because that would help everyone. But at the moment, that we don't see that happening very, very often. But that's one thing that I would definitely recommend starts to happen as production and creative start to come together. I know there's a lady called Nikki Russell, who you might know.
Yes.
Nikki's fantastic. She described it once to me. She said, when you don't bring creative and production together, it's like taking a souffle out of the oven that's sort of sunk in the middle. It's never going to be perfect. So she said, we need to bring these two disciplines much closer together for it to be effective. And I think, so if you have creative and production, I'd add offshore production onto that mix to make sure that they have visibility as well. But in terms of KPI, so keeping it simple, I think it's down to right first time asset production. So how well it's been briefed in, how many amendment loops you've had to go through. Turnaround times, I think, is important, absolutely critical actually in terms of pace now. The third area I would consider looking at would be responsiveness to the client. So if they have a question, how quickly is your team coming back to them? And that's the type of thing where smart shoring can really help because of the fact they're in the same time zone, speaking the same language, although everyone speaks English now, but in terms of offshore, but they're in the same time zone. So it's responsiveness to actual queries and questions that are coming in from the customer. I would also be monitoring that. So, and then quality, I suppose, on brand, on time, I would check that metric out as well. But I'd maybe just have like 4 or 5 key components that I would look at initially around right first time, quality of the asset, turnaround time, and responsiveness to any questions that are coming in. And then I would build on from there.
Those are all good. I really like the right first time one because I think looking at that metric and then analyzing how it's trending will then shed light on, is briefing working well? Does the process need to change? I think, and I would imagine that most clients want to get to like that right first time, getting closer and closer to 100% would be the ideal, right? I doubt that has happened with anyone doing offshore production, but that to me seems like a great North Star metric when it comes to offshore production is right first time.
It's interesting. I've definitely seen, so when companies first on board, you've got to prepare yourselves for a little bit of upheaval. It's not going to be right first time. In the same way, if you were just sending it down the road to another production studio, there's always going to be that slight challenge around getting it right first time. But if you should be able to overcome that now. and not necessarily say it's down to the fact it's offshore. It's just down to the fact that we haven't worked together before. But over the next 2 to 3 months, as you develop more and more campaigns together, I would absolutely recommend that you want to be pushing that sort of 99%, 100% even mark, because it is repeatable work primarily we're talking about here. If you're moving into UX type work, or you're doing a landing page or some web development, which is more where the goalposts may change, the scope of work may change halfway through the project, then those things I think are a little bit more challenging to do right first time and need more hand holding. But I think with digital banners, if that's all we were doing, I would expect that to be quite close to 100% once we've got into a good way of working.
Okay, and that's a good segue into the last area I wanted to touch on is, and it's come up multiple times, but I want to go a little bit deeper if we could, automation and AI, especially, and I think AI is just the evolution of automation in my mind. So right first time, as you said, if it's highly mechanized work like web banners, then getting to 100%, you could do today. And that's with humans in the process. And as you've shared with us today, offshore production teams tend to have some automation capabilities already that they've been building and investing into over a number of years. And now we have AI at our doorstep. And I think AI is going to enable scale like we've never seen before. I in fact heard recently about a brand using an AI tool and to literally create millions of landing pages. And the problem now is that a lot of the landing pages are looking similar, right? So the quality issue is sameness. I don't know if that's a word, but I'll use it. But thinking of from the perspective of a brand working with an offshore production partner, if I'm going to have these AI tools, so I'm a creative ops leader and I'm going, am I going to be facing a future where I'm going, do I use an AI tool or do I use an offshore production partner? Or is it, and I think we sort of alluded to this earlier in the conversation, am I going to rely on my offshore production partner to figure out how to use AI to scale content? And maybe the benefits I get are just more scale, more speed, lower cost per asset. And I don't need to figure out the complexity of having to figure out which AI tool, how do I train it, and how do I do all these other things with it. So, and I know I'm asking you to look into the crystal ball, and crystal balls are always a little bit hazy. Like, what do you think the future is with AI?
I mean, oh God, I wish I knew the answer, Nish. I think again, I was listening to one of your previous podcasts and you talked about the trough of disillusionment with AI. And we've gone through that period and we're back into people looking at it as a means of solving their problems again, I think. And like you, I've been involved in the MarTech world since 2000. And this idea of like machine learning and automation, to some extent, has been with us all the way through that period, actually. I think I've been working with digital asset management systems for 20 plus years now, and things like extended metadata tagging, intelligent searches, they've actually been around for quite some time now. Whether organizations have embraced them, it's hard to say, but they're there. Conversational AI, the utilization of that, I mean, that is still a channel to market. And that type of thing has been around for a while. But then ChatGPT was, I think, really what changed the narrative in terms of how consumers started to perceive AI and also automation. And that's transitioned into the business world almost overnight. I think with automation, if we just talk about automation first, automation is definitely getting to a fairly mature level, I would say, in terms of being part of the ecosystem, being part of your technology strategy. It has obvious benefits for certain types of assets being produced in an automated fashion. What might have taken 4 days for digital banners, you can now do in 4 hours. You can do them en masse. You can deliver a certain level of personalization through that automation engine as well. Perhaps not to the level that we would like, but it's definitely there. So we're seeing significant time savings, and that's really helping organizations who are looking at pace in terms of automation. I think also just coming back to packaging again was one thing I mentioned earlier, like automation of packaging, artwork creation. That's been around for a while now, and the more savvy organizations have been utilizing that capability and those workflows to build packaging in an automated way, because you can template a lot of that type of activity. So automation, I think, in the next three years will become a mainstay. It will extend. We're seeing some great automation now, obviously, for video post-production, subtitling, localization of assets, that type of area. Absolutely should be in your technology strategy, or when you're assessing a production partner, whether it's offshore or not, you should be evaluating what their capabilities look like, and then perhaps not necessarily buying that in yourself, but leaning in on them, letting them pick up the cost of the licenses, etc. So that's automation. In terms of AI, it's going to put personalization on heat. We're going to get like thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of assets being produced, because AI is going to just drive that level of personalization that we're looking for. I was actually just trying to think of a quote that CM said to me once. She said, we're at the like fetal stage of AI, but it will basically drive personalization beyond anything that's recognizable today. And I think we're seeing AI being utilized to some extent. As I mentioned earlier, retouching is an area, image manipulation, object removal, enhancing of an asset, enhancing low-res images. So that's been in play, and it has to be because of the shift to e-commerce, the direct-to-consumer market, and the way that's developed. AI from a creative standpoint, and I know there's a lot being documented about this, I think people are still trying to figure it out. Storyboarding, yes. Creative concepting, absolutely. I think we all do that ourselves. Whether you're working in a studio or not, you're doing that. But that probably is where it currently sits at the moment. And then obviously for elements of copywriting, but it's still not great for copywriting. It'll give you a B minus or a C plus, and really you want to be an A plus every time. So I think we're seeing, again, our companies moving into that world, but just trying to figure out what it can look like from an ethical standpoint, from an IP standpoint. Organizations are building it into their wider strategic ecosystem, but there's a lot of unknowns, and I think that will continue at least for the next 12 to 18 months around AI, whether it's production or creative. But production will embrace it first, more so than creative, I believe.
I agree with you. So when it comes to using AI, I think on the creative side, and if that is going to be primarily done by the in-house agencies, then I think AI tools are great for ideation and inspiration and this sort of a storytelling springboard, if you will. I think for production, I do see some of the AI tools that are out there today that can be trained with brand assets getting better and better. And if I were a creative operations leader, I'd almost think about, and this sort of goes back to what we were talking about earlier in the conversation, offshoring. I don't like to think in black and white usually, but I do think one of the rules should be creative operations leaders should look to outsource to offshore production teams, or just outsource all tier 3 and tier 2 work, full stop. And I think that should be the rule. And there should be but there could be exceptions, but you have to make a very good argument for why you wouldn't do that. Because again, for all the reasons that we've been talking about, speed, scale, so on and so forth, so critical to how a creative operations leader needs to be able to have their creative team perform, and creative team writ large, including external partners. And then when it comes, and then sort of extending that into AI, is then partnering with their offshore partners to figure out how to use these AI tools to scale. And then the offshore partners may have a rebalancing over time, as I'm sure has happened as automation capabilities have been developed, of what are the humans doing and what are the machines doing. And I think as a creative operations leader, that would be attractive to me as well, because I can then almost partner with the offshore partners as a AI testing bed. And instead of trying to have the discussions internally today with my IT team and everybody else that I need to get lined up behind this, I can work with my offshore partner, and what I'm able to deliver to the organization, to the CMO, is more assets more quickly and more cost efficiently. And my partner is figuring out how to get these AI tools to work so that down the road, I have the option of, oh, we've already got our AI scale partner through our offshore partner, or we can take that learning. And if we want to down the road, bring it in house. But I probably wouldn't want to bring it in house because ultimately, I don't care about AI as the end goal. What I care about is, am I getting more assets? Am I getting them more quickly or on time? And am I getting them at a lower cost?
It's an enabling technique. Actually, just there's one more point that I just as you were speaking that came to me. I mean, also this shift to virtual production, which is an area that I'm heavily sort of immersed in. The utilization of Unreal Engine, for example, which again is effectively an AI solution. You're creating environments that you can then create, like literally a press of a button, thousands and thousands of assets on the back of that single environment that you've already sort of created in pre-production. And then those assets can also be culturally nuanced for that moment in time. And there's some great stats. I think McKinsey have been looking into this area about, again, the pace of production being driven by Unreal Engine, the cost savings that are available to you, but actually the uplift in sales by using those AI-enabled environments to make it feel like a more personalized experience for the end consumer. And we're starting to see Unreal sort of take over a little bit around photography and packaging, as well as obviously high-end video content that's being produced in those environments. But that's one area I think we're going to see a significant shift to AI using technologies like that, which I think most in-house teams are starting to engage with, but it's very early stages because the talent pools are actually quite expensive. And again, that's probably another reason for looking for an offshore, because those talent pools will grow quicker offshore than they will do in the West.
That's a really good insight, because I think personalization it's ripe for so many opportunities, a lot of which will be enabled by AI, but there's also a lot of risk. And I think the risk in the short term is going to be what I think of as like transactional personalization, where we know just enough where we can personalize the email or whatever the content is or whatever the creative is, but it's not deep enough. So it almost feels like somebody is stalking me versus actually knowing me. And I think in the near term, I think we'll just have enough to do that sort of transactional personalization that, again, will sort of feel like stalking. And I think turn a lot of the end audience off. And I think the opportunity with AI is to go beyond that, to have a much deeper and more immersive understanding of the individual. And I think where the really exciting stuff is, as you said, is to build these virtual environments where it feels like natural for somebody to step into, to inhabit. So the personalization is more through the overall experience versus staying at the surface level or transactional, which is where I think we are today.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And I think that's why I'm so excited by the future. I think there's huge potential, huge opportunity. And there's a model, isn't there, around like change and how organizations lean into change. And basically, once you get over that initial denial and then you move to fear, once you get over the fear, then you get to the acceptance level because you've explored what the possibilities look like. And once you've moved into exploration and you've moved into acceptance, then you can start to build and invest and sort of evolve. And I think this industry, our industry, creative operations in particular, I think actually feels most comfortable in that exploration area of those four elements of change. And that's what I love about this industry so much, the fact that we are always willing to explore and always willing to sort of reset and then rebuild. And that's why, having been involved in technology and offshore pretty much my entire career, those are two areas that it's great to see them having come together now with automation and offshore, really starting to sort of own their place in the production models that we talked about. And it's great to see the offshore market delivering so much value to so many brands around the world. And the world's never been flatter, right? Everything's so accessible now. So that's also what I'm really excited about, the fact that organizations are working with countries that 10 or 15 years ago, they would never considered sending like the crown jewels, the brand assets to some of these organizations who are doing an incredible job as an extension of the studios that currently exist. And yeah, it's a really exciting time, I think, hence your podcast being super exciting for us all. So yeah, I'm sort of really looking forward to the next 5 years to see what it delivers.
Well, that's a great note to end on, the exciting future. I'm equally excited about it. And Anil, thank you very much for doing this today. I will put a link in the show notes to your recent report that you put out.
Wonderful,
and lots of great insight and wisdom that you've delivered today. And I think we will definitely need to have you back, because offshore production and just sort of creating a more robust ability as a creative operations leaders to be able to scale content at speed is something that is at the top of everybody's mind, and everybody's trying to figure out how to do it well. And I think you've given lots of good things for people to think about as they go on their own offshore journey. So we'll definitely have you back for some follow-up questions.
Wonderful. That's very kind. And I've really enjoyed speaking with you today. I look forward to the next one.
All right. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. Cheers.